Welcome to the Loins of History podcast. I'm Collin, and I'm joined by my co-host Jay. And for this series, we're going to be talking about the history of politics. And for this first episode, we're going to start with American politics. And what we really want to do is dig into the theories and ideas that were circulating amongst the founders and the American people prior to 1776, and explore some of the root causes and grievances that the founders and the American people felt before they declared their independence. And then we're going to take that and we're going to start moving into the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and some of the other documents that our founding fathers wrote in defense of their new republic. So with that being said, let's begin.
Recently Roe v. Wade was just overruled, and some of the feedback that we was just really telling that a lot of Americans don't understand our political process. For example, there were quite a few people treating Roe v. Wade as if it was a law.
That's a really good
conversely,
point.
There were other... Yeah, like in kind of both ways. Like, there were pro-choice folks that were saying like, oh, I don't know, treating like this was written in the law and blah, blah, blah. And there were pro-life folks that were saying like abortion's legal everywhere now. And it's like, nope, like that's not, neither of those things are true.
I talk about this a little bit in some of our exclusive Patreon content, breaking down this Roe v. Wade decision. But you're right. At no point since Roe v. Wade was abortion ever actually codified into law. It was simply interpreted under the 14th Amendment by the Supreme Court. That is an important note to make because that shows the Americans' lack of understanding of the political process and what the founders wanted from our justices. So they did not want them to legislate. They wanted them to interpret laws. And I think we're going to talk about that, especially John Adams and some of the other founders and their writings on what they envisioned for our government and the separation of powers.
It's frustrating because it's important. Like our political system is, we have a constitutional democratic republic, and that presupposes that the citizens who make up the republic are informed and actually participate in the political process. And if those citizens are working on bad information, the political process itself is jeopardized because it's like trying to run an engine when it's got like gravel inside of it. It's like it's not working functionally, or maybe not even gravel, but it's like you put random parts in there that they don't know what they're doing.
Well, I think that's another reason and another point that a lot of the founders tried to make is that we are not just this direct democracy. I think that's a term you hear thrown out so often, and people assume, well, 51% of the people want this. Why don't we have it? And they actually talk a lot about that in, I go back to John Adams, his thoughts on government, and some of these writings of other founders, the Federalist Papers, they talk about guarding against the passions of the people. And this is really why, because a lot of Americans, especially now, are really with a lack of understanding of the political process, can't fully participate the way that they're intended to. A direct or a democracy like the one where people think that 51% say this, so we get what we want, can actually be tyrannical. And the founders talk about that a lot. And that's actually why they wanted to set the government up the way that they have it now. I don't mean to digress too much and slam most American citizens now, but I think that's why we're talking about this, because it is very important to understand where our country came from and where the systems of government that we have in place come from.
Right.
We pledge allegiance to the republic, not to the democracy, not to the king, not to someone else. It's a republic, and it's important that people understand that and how it's formed and the political theories and ideas that led up to it in 1776.
Yeah, and I don't want to criticize American citizens too much because in a very real sense, this is just human nature, right? Like, there's people all over the world who completely don't understand their political process. But here in our context, Colin and I are Americans, and we want to uh, speak to uh, kind of in a sense our own families, right? Like not like our biological families, but like Americans writ large. Like we're all kind of uh, in this together. You know what I mean? Like we've got to figure this out. Like we've kind of had a rough go the last few years, and we want to help the family get back up on its feet. So this is our very uh, well intentioned effort to try to do that.
So that's a good way to put it. With that being said, in today's environment, with as politicized as everything is, it's important to understand when we talk about American history and the people that men and women that made American history, there's a tendency on both sides of the political spectrum to either on one side deify everyone who lived in American history. The founders, they did no wrong. They were perfect. Everything they did, it was amazing, and we deify
Hmm.
them. And on the other side, they tend to vilify because they see them through our 21st century lens, and they see the injustice that they did not right and some of the things that they did that were wrong. And I think what Jay and I are going to do, especially when we talk about American history, is humanize those people that made American history, the founders, the men and women that just lived their lives through the revolution, through these tumultuous times, because that's the best way we can understand history. We can understand that they were men and women who were products of their time, and oftentimes they were thrust into situations that were unbelievably difficult. And there was a lot of opportunity, a lot of hardship, and they made the best possible decisions that they could have made. And I think that for the most part, they did it as well intentioned as they could. So they didn't have intentions of, evil or wrongdoing, or they may not have necessarily been perfect, but they did the best that they could at the time.
Right. No, that's good. All right. Without further ado, let's get to our first topic here. And the first one that I would like to discuss, or the first question uh, that we're going to discuss, are what are the political ideas that helped cause the American Revolution? So this first episode is going to be on, uh, uh, the political foundation behind the American Revolution. All right. So with that, we're going to move on to the first question. This first series or this first episode rather, is going to be about the political ideas behind the American Revolution or the American War for Independence. So the first question is, what political ideas caused the American Revolution? And the first topic that I would like to cover is the founder's idea of liberty and power. So I'm going to read a quote from a fantastic book that I'll recommend to our listeners called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailyn. It is an absolute classic in the field. He has a whole chapter dedicated towards this idea of liberty and power, but I'm just going to read one section of it. So this is Bailyn. The very idea of liberty was bound up with the preservation of this balance of forces. For political liberty, as opposed to the theoretical liberty that existed in a state of nature, was traditionally known to be a natural power of doing or not doing whatever we have a mind, so long as that doing was consistent with the rules of virtue in the established laws of a society to which we belong. So, pausing real quick. He's defining liberty here using the founder's own language. It is you having a mind to do whatever you want to do, as long as it's consistent with two things: the rules of virtue and the established laws of society. Continuing on, it was a power of acting agreeable to the laws which are made and enacted by the consent of the people, and in no ways inconsistent with the natural rights of a single person or the good of society. Liberty, that is, was the capacity to exercise natural rights within set limits set not by the mere will or desire of men in power, but by non arbitrary law. Law enacted by legislatures containing within them the proper balance of forces. I I love this quote for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot to unpack here, but just generally speaking, when we talk about freedom and liberty in this country, it's very important to keep in mind liberty is not unchecked desires, i.e., I can just do whatever the heck I want to do whenever I want to do it. Um, it's my, we claim our rights, and in this paragraph, he refers to natural rights, which are not whatever I feel like. They're not self-declared rights. They're rights that have been given by, in the founder's words, God and nature, and that liberty is checked by a law. And this idea of liberty and power is that the most free people are people who are governed by a law. It's not this anarchic, chaotic scenario where we can do uh whatever we want to
That
do.
is a really good quote. I think it's interesting when you read that. Again, just researching this episode, I kept coming back to John Adams, and it's interesting about those the interwar period between the French and Indian Wars, or if you're European, the 7 Years' War and the Revolution. A lot of his grievance, and in his writing, his grievance against the British was that they were not represented, and he felt that there was oppression on the United States because they were not represented. So the British were basically passing laws, um, without anybody in Parliament representing the colonies. And not only that, but there was impressment, there was quartering of soldiers, there was special courts where they were basically admiralties, which were military courts. So people were not being tried by their peers. So his grievance a lot of times was with these laws being passed that were not representative, and he felt that their liberty was being infringed on because there was no consent, there was no representation, and they in his writings and then in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you see them appeal to a higher law. In natural law, excuse me,
Mhm.
not necessarily. Yeah, I guess natural law is a higher law, but they appeal to a higher source, the Creator, God, because then they were able to take a look and say, well, who are you, a king? Who are you, this government body that is going to question your creator, the creator, or in their instance, God, um, with these rights that are inalienable?
No, you bring up a really good point, because this this dichotomy, or well, it's not a dichotomy. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. This idea between liberty and power, and Balin talks about this at length in this chapter, is these two ideas are not opposed to one another. They're complementary to one another. And very often we think that in order to have liberty, you need to have no power. And the reality is that you need to have some. You need to have a check upon uh, human beings' more baser desires, to have maximum liberty. However, if power also gets out of whack, and you have, again, referencing Adams, if you have a legal system, a legislature that is moving beyond its proper bounds, then liberty is infringed upon, which is their entire complaint against British Parliament. Um, there were these political power entities that were infringing upon their liberties. one thing that we haven't talked about yet, but uh, Balin talks about prior to this idea of the balance of forces within those power structures in government. He kind of references it in the first and last sentences of the paragraph that I quoted. But the idea was that within British society, the legislature was not merely what we call the legislative branch of government. It's what they call the entire government. And they would have considered the executive and judicial parts as part of when he references the legislative law enacted by legislatures, they would have envisioned that entire thing. So the balance of powers or the balance of forces being referred to here is really in the American legal system is expressed in a division of power between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. They all serve as a check upon one another to keep their power contained in its proper place so that not any one of them, not any particular portion of the government infringes upon the
So
liberty of the people.
that is a really good segue to a nice little tangent I want to go on. So here we go. Strap in for a little tangent. Yeah.
Stand by, folks.
So, you can see this, I think, in a great example of where this idea of liberty, it can almost be kind of like excess liberty and allowing people to basically do whatever they want can run into tyranny. And it's the French Revolution. If you look at the French Revolution, it started out as this grand idea of like, okay, now we, the people of France, are going to establish a more representative government. And in a lot of ways, it was inspired by the American Revolution. And a lot of the founders, including John Adams, were very optimistic initially about the French Revolution. But you can see that there weren't these proper checks and balances. And it went from this revolution of people just trying to get equal rights and wrong some of these or right some of these wrongs. And it became a reign of terror where people were just being beheaded. And a lot of the architects of the French Revolution, like Robespierre, they were beheaded by the very mob that they helped create because there's not these proper checks and balances. It descended into chaos. And what happened right after that? Napoleon comes in and he's an even stronger dictator than they had before. So I think that's a perfect example of this idea that there needs to be checks and balances, there needs to be limits, and in those limits and these almost kind of these fences that we're going to say, hey, we're going to protect these laws that protect liberty. That's a perfect example of why we have them. So let's get back on topic. That's enough of my little tangent, unless you have something you want to add about that.
No, it's so again, Balin talks about it here. These limits that are healthy checks upon quote unquote liberty, they're not arbitrary. And I love how Balin says this here. That is liberty, that is, was the capacity to exercise natural rights within limits set not by the mere will or desire of men in power, but by non-arbitrary law. Meaning that the law that gets codified in law is needs to reflect natural rights and not, oh, I'm a person X or body of people X that wants to maintain power and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. As a matter of fact, that was kind of the whole reason for the American Revolution, is that they believed that a lot of those laws and taxes were arbitrary and unfair and unjust. And that's why in the Declaration of Independence, they talk about severing the bonds between the Britain and the colonies. Because they have overstepped their bounds and are infringing upon their liberties. So, for here in the United States, again, thinking about Roe v. Wade and the recent Supreme Court decision, it is, the laws that should be reflected should be those of that are reflected in natural law. And I don't want to turn this into a discussion about abortion, but when it comes to, the Supreme Court, the decision of the Supreme Court was not whether or not abortion should be legal. Rather, it was this was not a law that was or this was not a right given in the Constitution, and the Constitution is supposed to be reflective of natural law. So,
I do want to make a quick point
go
about
ahead.
natural law. Natural law is universal, so it is not applicable specific to Americans or specific to, at the time, white males. It was something that universally everyone has these rights. So I just want to make that quick point because that's important to note, and I think it sets the foundation for a lot of the changes that occurred in the Constitution throughout the United States history. And to your point, we do talk about this in some of our Patreon exclusive content. But yeah, the in Justice Alito's opinion, he actually goes through the 14th Amendment and looks into liberty. And because it is not expressly written in the Constitution, he felt uncomfortable prescribing what is actually entailed in liberty, something like abortion. And he goes on a long, very long opinion explaining why he can't. He cites some different cases like Collins versus Harker Heights. But you, to your point, I just wanted to say natural law is applicable to everyone.
Mhm. You know, another really good, well, starters, thank you, Colin. That's a great point. It is universal. It's not applicable to it, or it's not only applied to a specific, group of people. Another good case in point here to kind of, flip the script a little bit is the Second Amendment. The uh, self-defense, it could be argued, is a natural right. Like everyone has the right to defend themselves. However, that doesn't mean you get to possess any weapon that you want in order to defend yourself. But it doesn't mean that, the government can take away reasonable means of self defense. And, it wasn't too long ago when the gun control Second Amendment debate in the United States wasn't a matter of guns versus no guns, right? Like this strict dichotomy of like we're trying to take away all the guns versus I'm going to have all my guns. Like it didn't used to be that way. And it's important to remember with regards to this conversation, the trying to take away all firearms, which I know there's a very small minority of people in this country who actually think that's a good idea. But that is an infringement upon the natural right of self-defense, which I think is ultimately what the Second Amendment is trying to get after. Conversely, something to keep in mind is that your right to own whatever firearm that is not consistent with second or which is not consistent with self-defense is not unlimited. Like it's you don't need a nuclear bomb to protect your household, right? So
So that is I'm not going to call it a segue because we're not really changing gears, but we might shift lanes, if you will. So from this natural law that is universal, the only way, and the founders say this time and time again, the only way that government exists is through, or the only just way a just government can exist is through the consent of the governed. We don't, natural law is not subservient to a government entity. Um, Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that's taken directly from the Declaration of Independence. So, what that means is I have these natural rights, like the right to self defense. And in order for a government to legislate and enforce these laws, I have to allow that. So, with a lot of these Supreme Court decisions, it can be argued that they really were upholding our constitutional rights by turning it back over to those who most directly represent us in a state. These decisions were given back to the people the way the Supreme Court dealt or deemed and interpreted the law as it is written. So they wanted to give that power back to the people through legislative means.
no, that's actually because we talked a lot about natural law in this idea of liberty and power and consent of the governed. Um, that's a really good segue to the next quote I wanted to read from Balaam, where he connects these ideas of the consent of the governed with representation, and he specifically introduces an American view on representation in government, as opposed to how it was how representation was developing in British Parliament at the time. So this is Balaam. The view of representation developing in America implied, if it did not state, that direct consent of the people in government was not restricted, as Locke would have had it, to those climactic moments when the government was overthrown by the people in a last final effort to defend their rights, nor even to those repeated benign moments when a government was peaceably dissolved and another chosen in its place. Real quick, what he's talking about right there is that direct consent of the people is not just limited to either when we elections or overthrowing of governments. Rather, and he continues here, uh, where government was such an accurate mirror of the people, sensitively reflecting their desires and feelings, consent was a continuous, everyday process. In effect, the people were present through their representatives and were themselves, step by step and point by point, acting in the conduct of public affairs, no longer merely an ultimate check on government. They were, in some sense, the government. Government had no separate existence apart from them. It was by the people as well as for the people. It gained its authority from their continuous consent. So, what he's talking about in this paragraph here is that within an American democratic republic, we do not merely express our consent to government only during midterm and general elections. That's not it at all. Rather, what's supposed to be happening in the way that our founders envisioned it is that the representatives that are elected to their people or elected by the people should be, one, reflections of the people themselves, and two, continuously accountable to the people. There was a lot of debate that I didn't want to go into too much detail here, but there's a lot of debate leading up to the revolution and during the Constitutional Congress about having representatives as attorneys of their constituents, not attorneys in the sense of, like, you know, that we think of now, a lawyer standing before a judge, but rather the the representative of the constituent, and there is no divergence in opinion between what the law should be. Um, they envision, and we see this later expressed in the Constitution. The U.S. House of Representatives at the federal level is supposed to be the closest reflection of the people, and then the Senate is supposed to be still a reflection of the people, but a legislative body that's supposed to have a more long-term focus. And it's that counter. This is what was written against in the Federalist Papers quite a bit, a counter to their fear of what they called mob rule. So there's a trade-off here. If you only have representatives that are 100% beholden to the people, people tend to be kind of whimsy
Oh
flippy
yeah.
floppy, right? And they needed stability in the government, and that's kind of where the
Well,
Senate
yeah,
comes
no,
into
I
play.
think,
Go ahead,
well,
Colin.
two things right there. So, one, that is definitely a call to be involved in the political process and to be involved with the government, both for our American listeners and then our international listeners as well. You need to be involved and you need to be informed. And I think, two, what you get into is what Jay was mentioning was the Great Compromise, where you had, at the time, you had strong feelings from the states, because the states were, at the time, the states were very different. So you had some very populous states and some not so populous states, and they felt, the populous ones felt like they were being unjustly governed by states that were much smaller, and their interests were going to be trampled, and that it was going to be a power trip. Whereas the small states felt like they were going to be basically swept aside when it came to um, governmental affairs. The compromise essentially established a bicameral legislature. So you had an upper and a lower house. And John Adams, what a fantastic founder. I feel like we should do a whole series on him by himself, just doing some reading on it. But he was a real champion for bicameral legislature. And that was where you have the Senate, which is each state is represented by the same number of senators. And then you have a representation in a lower house, the House, where it is representative of the population. What this did was allow both interests to be represented. We're having a tough time. And I think that's important because now, like you mentioned, the passions of the people and mob rule, those can be very heavily influenced, especially if you have politicians who are only directly responsible for their small population that they represent. So think about your local congressman. If his interest is solely on your congressional district, and that's all, and he's the only legislative body that makes up the legislature, he's going it nothing is going to get done. His interests may direct, so there's nobody looking focused on the national front. I think this is important because the founders were ardent students of the classics. So they looked back and they saw in Rome that people and the mob was vital to political stability in Rome. And people's loyalties could be bought through bread and games. So they were concerned that, if they only had this one legislative body that was essentially run by the mob, as they thought, you could have tyranny creep in because they could very easily be influenced by only their specific district.
One one more kind of shifting gears to another idea that uh, helped cause the American Revolution is this idea of what's called the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, and it was kind of one of the main justifications for, some would say resistance, some would say rebellion, but one of the main justifications for severing the bonds between the what later became the United States and the British Crown. Essentially, this idea is that, a magistrate is just another name for a governing body, right? It could be a person, it could be a senate, something like that. A magistrate is, a person or a group of people representing the government. And the founders uh, went to great lengths to explain their independence in what's called just war theory. So there's a fantastic book by a friend of mine named Eric Patterson called Just American Wars: Ethical Dilemmas in U.S. Military History. And he has a chapter dedicated to um, the American Revolution. And he talks about, there was a document written in 1775 that kind of explains why the founders, or rather, it was written in 1775, and it couched the American Revolution in just war terms. Dr. Patterson would probably he likes calling it the American War of Independence because saying it wasn't a revolution, but the so there was a document written by a Pennsylvania dude named John Dickinson called "The Declaration on the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms," and one of the things that he talks about is uh, during the revolution how they were severing those bonds under a legitimate authority. And that legitimate authority was the Constitutional Congress and its elected legislatures. This idea, or sorry, it was under the Constitutional Congress and their elected representatives. This idea of the lesser magistrate is when, if there's going to be a um, a rebellion, and that's probably not the best word to use, but if there's going to be a rebellion, um, it's not this anarchic, chaotic situation where people just take up arms against the government, mobs form, and they just start, shooting rifles up in the air. That's not how this is supposed to work. That's not couched under just the just war tradition. Rather, it is under the the separation has to occur under a legitimate authority. And this idea of the lesser magistrate, we even saw this in the Civil War, by the way. The uh it wasn't like the good old boys up in the Appalachians just saying we don't work for Abraham Lincoln no more. uh it was this, they were state legislatures that had a legal process that declared their independence, from the federal government. So, and this was very consistent with this idea of the lesser
So
magistrate.
that's a good point. And just to put it in context, as far as the idea of the lesser magistrate, America between the French and Indian Wars, or if you're European, the 7 Years' War, and the Revolution was like a powder keg of rebellion. Um, there were numerous quote rebellions, riots. There's a couple slave uprisings. So the idea that the American Revolution was the only one was not it. It was really the culmination of, like Jay said, it was the culmination of all of these founders coming together and forming this legitimate body of representational government, listing their grievances, and then forming a government and declaring their independence, or forming a legitimate body to declare their independence. Beforehand, like you said, in Appalachia, it's not just some good old boys wanting to say, I just want to live by myself. That's really not it. There was a plan, there was a purpose, and it was legitimate. I think that's what the point you're trying to make. It was a legitimate
Yeah.
representation of the people.
Yeah, and to be honest, the idea that I'm trying to push back against right now is there's been a lot of talk in the last few years about when the second American Civil War is going to take place. And it's primarily, the conversation's primarily being held on the right, like the political right, and it's by individuals who they rightfully see government overstepping quite a few of its bounds. The concerning thing that I want to push back against is that's one, I'm not advocating for the overthrow of the US government, just want to make that clear. But this idea is like, hey man, like John Boy and Billy are not going to get together and, start this mob insurrection against the US government. That is not the way in which to do that. The founders would be ashamed of that. You know, quite a few of these people are in the South. Like Robert E. Lee would be ashamed of that. Like it's a the founders of this country. This country was not initiated under anarchy. It was initiated under just causes and order, and people doing their due diligence to uh, ensure that they had an ethically proper uh, grounds for severing their bonds. And I'm not seeing that, like, which leads me to believe that a lot of these conversations that we're seeing about a second American Civil War is just fantasy. And uh, until we understand, like, you know, the American Revolution and the idea that the ideas that were behind it, we're not in a good spot when we have those kinds of
Another
conversations.
point to make, the founders and the framers of the Constitution were students of Hobbes and Locke and the classics, and they spent years crafting this. This was not somebody on Twitter very upset. And even if they had a legitimate grievance, they didn't just go out and get mad and start screaming. Um, and the point I made earlier about the powder keg of rebellion and revolution existing, there were a lot of people that tried to do that beforehand and they failed because there was no purpose, there was no aim, there was no um, legitimacy and ordered chaos or ordered rebellion behind it. It was just people who were upset and they had a legitimate grievance. The British were the taxes were they were taxes without representation. They were oppressive to not just the upper class but the middle class as well. The lower classes were being, they felt a lot of that as well, and they were the ones being impressed by the British, and that's actually what led to the Boston Massacre. There was a riot against impressment, and then the British soldiers began shooting them, and people were really upset that the British soldiers, like I think 6 of them were pardoned. There was I think 2 of them got discharged and they got a little
Mhm.
tattoo on their thumb, but that's about it. And people were really upset about that, rightfully so. And it laid the
Yeah.
groundwork for the American Revolution. But that act by itself of just rioting in the streets was not a legitimate revolution. And I think that's the point you're trying to make. And I
Right.
want to segue that,
Yeah.
dovetail, if you will. Um, oh, go ahead.
Well, hang on.
One
No,
more. I
I
want to
got
hear
one
it.
more quick comment if I can. One more quick comment because I want to piss off everyone equally in this episode, all right?
Love it.
the we talked about yeah, the people on the right. Like you're right. The aiming towards, looking now towards my family,
Your
not family,
comrades on
but
the
looking
left.
towards my fellow Americans, my comrades on the left here. Uh if the government does something you don't like, that does not give you the right to go and, like you said, riot and do all this crazy stuff in the streets. And it's a travesty that we have elected members of the government right now, uh, telling people that they need to go out into the streets because, like, okay, if you're going to go out in the streets and peacefully protest, knock yourselves out. That is a vital part of our political process. But if what you mean by going out into the streets means cause chaos and burn things down like the riots in 2020, that is wrong. That is not uh that is not under a legitimate authority. You're ruining people's lives, burning down their businesses, causing all kinds of damage because we want to have a temper tantrum, to put it mildly, because there's things in the government that we don't like to take place. Like we've got to get back to the idea that the way to express your grievances towards a higher government is through a legitimate authority, i.e., a lesser magistrate.
Boom.
Now I'm
No,
done
that's a great rant,
ranting.
and I love it. So, with that being said, what parts, and how do I want to phrase this question? Which of the ideas from the revolution and the pre-revolution should be kept today, and should any of them be abandoned? What do you think?
Yeah, so there were ideas as a part of the revolution, or and later into the Constitution, that are either not applicable or were wrong. Uh, the easiest one is the 3/5 compromise, right? The We now in today's day and age, like we've thankfully gotten to a point where we consider all people uh truly equal under the law. I know some people would disagree with me, but on that point, but the point being is that I don't want our listeners to take away from this episode that me personally, I won't speak for Colin, but the me personally, that like the founders were perfect, like Colin said at the beginning, the founders were perfect people. and everything that they came up with was fantastic. They gave us a mechanism to amend the Constitution,
That is a brilliant way to
uh,
put it.
and the yeah, like they gave us they knew they weren't perfect.
Exactly. Yeah,
And
that's good.
the and just to explain what the three-fifths compromise is, in the South, after this, the legislature was identified, there were quite a few more slaves in the South than there were the North, and there was an argument about, should slaves be counted in determining how many representatives a state can have in government. And after a lot of debate, what they came to was that in the House of Representative, a slave would count as three-fifths of a person. Uh, or, the total number of slaves, take three-fifths of that would, add on uh, to your population for representation in the House of Representatives. And it's like that was a shame. Like, I understand why they did that, and I'm not trying to, uh, again, apply 2022 ethical norms on, a 1780s process. But when it comes to the ideas that helped cause the American Revolution and the Constitution, that's definitely one of them that, thankfully, with the 14th or 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments,
Right. And
we got rid of.
there's also the fact that, women weren't allowed to vote. I mean, there's no mention of the word women in Constitution because, they were a political afterthought as well. So it was not even really thought of. And that has changed as
Right.
well, and for the better, and rightfully so. And I think you made a good point. They gave us a mechanism. The founders were not perfect. I am sure that they had their own prejudices, they had their own imperfections, they had their own problems. A lot of them, Thomas Jefferson was a kind of a walking paradox. He was anti-slave slavery, but he owned slaves till the day he died. With that being
Right.
said, they set the United States apart, and they put them on the U.S. on a trajectory that, through constitutional and legal means, we have remedied that. With the Bill of Rights and constitutional amendments, we've remedied that. It's not always perfect. It's not always pretty. The Civil War was fought over that, but we were able to maintain a union with this Constitution for over 200 years. And I don't think people really understand how unusual that is. If you were to look around the world at a place that is as ethnically, religiously, culturally, racially diverse as the United States, it really doesn't exist. I mean, the closest thing I can think of is like the Balkans. Um, and the Balkans, they call it balkanization. It's constant strife. Other than when they were Yugoslavia and they were dominated by a dictator, it's constant strife and fighting. And not to say the United States
Yeah.
has not had its fair share of strife and wars, we have, but we've maintained a union. And through these legitimate means, these grievances were aired, they were remedied, and they're still in the process of being remedied. So I just want to make that point that we are
Right.
not perfect. However, we are an exception to the rule. And I think that's one of the things when we humanize these founders, we need to look at it and say is they were the exception to the rule. Slavery in the 1780s was ubiquitous around the world. It was just a fact of life.
Right.
Women were a political afterthought. They were less than property in some places. But we formed a system that at
Yeah.
least tried to remedy that over the next couple hundred years. So I don't mean to. That is a long defense of the
Right.
founders, but it's really my attempt at humanizing, like I said, and trying to put some context behind what they did.
Mhm.
So you talked about what you're glad has changed. Can you tell me a little bit more? Like, what other political ideas or theories would you want to keep? I can tell you, I think limited government is absolutely essential.
Talking about the diversity of the United States, we we are ridiculously diverse. I don't know if it's worth, comparing to other countries or other places, but the even in the American Revolution, we may not have been as ethnically and linguistically diverse, but culturally there was there were very large disparities, so much so that like uh people from South Carolina did not get along with, representatives from New York and Massachusetts. And it almost like we didn't form a cohesive government because those two, groups of people didn't want to play nice with one another. And what that brought into our government was this idea of federalism and limited government, i.e., the federal government isn't this overarching um, or even primary form of government in people's day to day lives. Rather, we form a federal government for very limited purposes, not for all our hopes and dreams of governance. This is why we have the 10th Amendment for any power not expressly given is in the Constitution is given to the states. Uh, the primary form of government for Americans should be the local government, and everything is uh more limited as we go up the chain. And this is not just an idea that we need to keep. This is an idea that we desperately need to get back to, that uh we don't have to be a single legislative code for all 50 states. Go ahead, Colin.
No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, the idea of a local or local legislative body that can not I don't want to say solve your problems, but defend your liberty, it's more representative. I mean, you can either go to this strong central government that yes, it has lots of power, but your voice will not be heard. But if I go to my town council meeting, like I can stand up and talk to people that I know in my community and problems can get solved. That is what we need to get back to, and I think we've drifted so far away from that. There's I was listening to Professor Williams. He's a legendary economist and historian. He's written, excuse me, a lot about government and the Constitution. And I think he kind of, and I'm paraphrasing the way he said it here, but he was basically like, most people like government now because it does what would be considered illegal if they did it, i.e., the government can go to someone and take their stuff and give it to someone else. Now, even if it's done out of benevolence, the founders would not have liked that because they viewed your property as yours, and they wanted to limit the government's access to that as much as possible.
Right.
And I think there's a quote by Thomas Paine that I think oof, it really summarizes the founders' feelings on government. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. So that's what they felt about it. I'm not going to necessarily call the government or our government evil, but I think there can be abuses even out of benevolence.
Yeah, and the best way to prevent that as much as possible is for the primary form of government to be the one that's closest to the people, right? Not the federal government. It's super hard in today's world to not get caught up in, you know, CNN or Fox News, and we see this thing, the problem X occurs in some state that's 1,000 miles away from where I live. And it's like, maybe the solution to fix that problem is different for them than it would be in my situation. The I think this is important to keep in mind in the gun control debate. People bring up states like Japan where basically nobody has a firearm. And they say, well, why can't we do that in the United States? It's like, well, for starters, like there's drastically different cultures between the Japanese and the American people. And if we take that same principle and we apply it here, like the culture of, again, the Appalachian Mountains is drastically different than Southern California. And the same, maybe not quite as a large of a divide between America writ large and Japan, but there's still a cultural difference. Therefore, if LA County wants to have a particular set of rules that their people agree upon, go for it. But don't try to apply that same logic to going back to John Boy and Billy in the Appalachian Mountains, like that it may not work. Therefore, the federal government is not always the solution to a lot of these domestic problems that we have. And that government needs to be limited in a lot of ways so that uh we're not infringing upon
No, that's
people's
a great way to
liberties.
put it. And I think people now should realize that that is the best solution moving forward rather than trying to legislate more power to the central federal government in order to fix what they deem as a serious problem. Because I don't know if you've ever been to the DMV, but they're all run the same and it's poorly. So you don't want the DMV monitoring and, you know, uh, working through every facet of your life. It's not going to be effective. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point is it's not going to be as effective. It's not going to be as tailored to your specific location. So, another thing I think that we need to continue to maintain is the separation of powers, the checks and balances, the separation of government, in that, we have three different bodies: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And within the legislative branch, we have a bicameral legislation, an upper and a lower house. And there's the vice president is the president of the Senate. And, the judicial branch, I think it was John Adams again, to go back to him. He talked about the judicial branch, and it might have been another founder, I can't remember, but they talk about the judicial branch being apolitical. And the reason they want them to be apolitical and they want to keep a political party out of the judicial branch is in order to maintain a separation of interest. Because if they are, for right now, if you had a bunch of Democrats or Republicans on the judicial branch, they would feel loyalty to that political party and that political party's wants and desires. And then suddenly you have a judicial bench who is no longer interpreting the law as it is written, but they are now interpreting based on what their political party wants. And that's not what we want. And that's not what the founders wanted. Now I think the debate is more around originalism versus activism in the judicial branch. But I think we need to maintain that
Mhm.
separation of powers, and people need to understand that that is there for a reason, in order to prevent power being centralized and tyranny from occurring.
Right. No, that's a really good point. And I would like to just call our listeners, anytime you see a news outlet talking about conservative versus liberal justices, you should immediately be suspect of that news outlet, because those Supreme Court justices are not conservative versus liberal. That's a very thinly veiled attempt to paint certain justices as Republican and certain justices as Democrats, which is not, as Colin was saying, that's definitely not how the justices see themselves. And that's not, if you actually read their opinions, that's not how they're coming to these conclusions. Rather, there's two different schools of thought of how to interpret the Constitution. And a great case in point of this is when Justice Roberts was the deciding vote on the Affordable Health Care Act, or also known as Obamacare. And he decided, or his opinion was, that the fine was not a fine, rather it was a tax and was permissible or something like that. I'll have to double check. Didn't do my homework here, but when he did that, when asked later, like why he said that, and the Affordable Health Care Act is still applicable in a lot of ways today. He said one of his main motivations was to preserve the integrity of the Supreme Court, and he felt like there was a little bit of partisan activity going on, i.e., Republicans versus Democrats, and he, as being appointed by George W. Bush, a Republican in office, it was almost like he was trying to go the extra mile in just showing, like, I'm not a Republican, I'm a Supreme Court justice, if that makes any
No,
sense.
that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, you brought up a good point. You need to read their opinions, which I recommend, especially on some of these controversial opinions like the Affordable Health Care Act, Roe v. Wade. You will see that they are absolutely trying to to make their interpretations based off the Constitution. Whereas, originalists, they try and envision what the founders would have wanted in keeping with the spirit of the original Constitution. Whereas judicial activists believe that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that is written over 200 years ago, so it is subject to change based on the times. So those are the two schools of thought that are competing against each other, and obviously, you know, we can politicize the court because most Republicans tend to lean toward judicial originalism, and more liberal Democrat judges tend to be more activist. But my point in saying that is these Supreme Court justices are apolitical, and the founders wanted to keep it that way for a reason. So, and I think that is something we need to strive to maintain in order to protect our liberties as best we can.
No, Colin, that's a really good point. And for our listeners, just a reminder, you can check out more. We have a Patreon subscribers only podcast series, of which Colin is going through a special series on the Supreme Court and talking more about the Roe v. Wade decision. So please help support this channel by or this podcast by supporting us on Patreon. It really goes a long way towards helping us keep this podcast advertisement free. And you also get exclusive access to our membership community where you have direct access to us. You can let us know, hey, I think you guys are talking about the wrong thing, or hey, that was a great idea, or this is what I think you should talk about next. We also share resources that we use in preparing for this podcast. So you can join us there on patreon.com/the Loins of History. And with that wraps up this episode. Colin, thanks again. A great conversation as always. For our next episode, we're really going to continue this conversation, but focus a little bit more on ideas in the Constitution, in the Federalist Papers, and we'll continue our walk through American political thought. Please check us out on we now have a YouTube page. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. We're building up our pages there. If you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify or whatever podcast resource you're doing, please give us a 5-star review and leave us a review. That goes a long way in helping get our podcast out there to some other listeners. And and this, if you're a Spotify listener, we also have some questions down below. So feel free to give us some comments, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation with y'all there. And with that concludes this episode of the Loins of History.